Good to see everyone today. This is Voice of the Voiceless. I'm Dan Kovalik, and with me today is Esperanza Fonseca. She works with an anti-imperialist feminist group called Affirm. She's also a labor organizer, and we're very excited to have her here today. Hello, Esperanza.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on today.
It's great to have you, and you're coming live from Oakland, California, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And you have a very iconic shirt on, a symbol of the Sandinista Revolution, one of my favorites. So it's great to have you. So let's dive in. As I was saying to you before the show, most of my shows, I have a very good working knowledge of the things that I'm interviewing people about. This is maybe a show where, I'm going to ask questions and learn from you, and that's great. I like to learn. So, as you know, we talked about, I have a book coming out on cancel culture, very critical of it, actually, from a left-wing perspective. And you told me in broad brushstrokes that you're facing some cancel culture issues yourself. First of all, and there's a couple issues I understand. One of them, as I understand it, involves your position on sex workers. And I wondered if you could just, tell us about that. Tell us your perspective on it. Tell us how you came, to care about that issue.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned a little earlier, I've been a union and community organizer for around 7 years now. When I started transitioning as a transgender woman, I lost my job and I lost my housing. And I also lost a lot of the support network that I had. And that had pushed me into the sex trade in order to survive, really. And after being able to exit the sex trade, which was not easy for me, I ended up, homeless in a shelter, dealing with some really horrible things. I began to reflect on the dominant discourse around the sex trade and how it's framed as an individual choice, as work like no other, and how, because of that, exit services and the right to exit are denied. And I began really studying this and investigating the issue, and it led me to releasing a letter, an open letter to the DSA and another organization,
Democratic Socialist of
their
America,
stance on the sex trade.
Okay.
So I released that open letter, and for the last 6 months now, I've gotten extreme forms of harassment, stalking, threatening to take my job away, trying to deplatform me, hacking attempts on my account, smears about myself and my organization, and it's only increased.
And what is it about your position that people don't like? I mean, where does the rubber hit the road here? What's the position that people take issue with?
So we agree on decriminalizing all of those in the sex trade, so who you might call sex workers. Where we disagree is that I don't believe in decriminalizing pimps, traffickers, and sex buyers.
That seems fair to me. I mean, that seems like a reasonable position. And why do people not only disagree with you, and that's fine, people can disagree, but why do they disagree so fervently about that?
Well, it's hard to sort of understand directly because there is no calm and rational conversation with these people. They immediately jump to, you're trying to kill trans people, you're trying to kill Black sex workers, you're trying to make us starve and take away all of our income. And I try sitting down and explaining, I want to remove any law that would put someone in prison, in jail, or penalize them in any way for doing what they need to do to survive. My concern is that by decriminalizing people who profit and benefit from exploitation, that one, we are removing any legal barrier that prevents people from increasing that exploitation. And two, is that we are allowing the sex industry to expand when we have not been able to fix the issues of violence and coercion in the sex trade. And if that expands, then so does the violence and the coercion and the exploitation within it.
Yeah, I mean, really, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it's really an anti-capitalist approach to it. I mean, you support the workers here, but you want to get rid of the managers and the capitalist exploiters in this relationship.
Absolutely. And so what a lot of people miss is that what I have sort of tried to uncover in my writing is the way in which what I would call the pimp lobby, or organizations which are funded and led in part by the sex industry, including known pimps, have been able to achieve a conflation between the worker and the boss, or the exploited and the exploiter. And so what you see is that there is a whole generation of liberals, they might consider themselves leftists, I do not, who think that any critique of the industry or of the dominant class is necessarily a critique of the worker or the subordinated class. And I find that to be completely insidious, because as a worker organizer, I know that our job is to expose the corruption and the exploitation in the industry so that workers can fight the people who benefit from that corruption and exploitation. If I were to do anything different, I would be a front group for the industry.
Yeah, honestly, I'll be totally honest. I don't even see the other side of this argument. I mean, I don't know many people who have a high regard for pimps. I mean, in the, most of the culture, it's a, pejorative statement to call someone a pimp of any sort. I also understand, by the way, that Cuba took this type of approach because Cuba had a problem, and maybe still does. I haven't followed it closely, but they had a problem with sex tourism and, again, prostitution. Again, particularly women and girls servicing tourists. And that, again, Cuba, in order to deal with the issue, tried to focus and crack down on pimps and other bosses, if we can use that word, but not on the prostitutes themselves. And I don't know if you know about that example at all.
Absolutely. So what we see is that the imperialist world has turned the third world into brothels. That happened in Cuba, it happened in Thailand, and it happened in the Philippines and several other nations that suffer under the boot of US imperialism. And so when an anti-imperialist party, an anti-imperialist worker party takes power in those areas, the first thing they do is kick out the imperialists. And that includes the sex tourists and the sex tourism industry that they forced upon their people. And so this is by no means a new position to take if you are a principled socialist or a principled imperialist. In fact, this is the line that's been held by revolutionaries for centuries now. When you look at what Thomas Sankara said about the issue, Frantz Fanon, Ho Chi Minh, all of the, anti-imperialist or Marxist, sort of theorists and revolutionaries, this was their line on the sex trade, going back to as early not only of Marx and Engels, but of Alexandra Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, who founded International Working Women's Day. This is not anything that I'm sort of making up, which is, I think, what they're arguing.
Yes, yes. And again, to me, it just stands to reason. And you yourself, as you mentioned, had an experience in this realm. And you talked about barriers to exiting the industry once you were in it. And are you comfortable talking, at least in broad brushstrokes, what that meant? Barriers to exit. What prevented you from exiting the industry?
Absolutely. So, the biggest thing is that most of us who are in prostitution are there because of poverty, because of economic need. And when you depend on prostitution full time for your income, that means that if you want to continue surviving, reproducing yourself day to day, you are going to need to have sex with men, even when you don't want to. There came a point where I was raped pretty brutally by someone, and my body completely shut off. Clients would come and I would not be able to touch them. I wouldn't be able to take my clothes off. And I realized that I was not able to continue this. At the same time, the doctors were pretty sure that my mom had cancer. They were doing the final testing. I had to pay money every month for my room so that I didn't go homeless. And so I had to keep working. But every session with a client was antagonistic because I couldn't do it anymore. There were no exit services for me. There was no place I could go for housing, for food, for healthcare, for mental health support. I was on my own. All of these shelters were a 12-month wait list, 6 months if you have children, if you're a single mom. That's what I mean by no exit services. And you see that in nations like New Zealand, which have fully decriminalized pimps and johns, that because sex work is like all other work, there's no need to provide specific exit services if you wouldn't for other kinds of workers.
Right. And how did you get out eventually, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I had to go through the fire. I went homeless. I was on the streets. I lived in people's cars. I went into a shelter for almost a month, struggled with getting EBT. In fact, I had one experience where I couldn't even buy hot food with my EBT. And so I could only buy, a bag of chips. I ended up later using that experience to pass a law in California that would allow anyone who is homeless, elderly, or disabled to buy hot food with their EBT.
It's an incredible story. And again, it's hard for me to fathom how people could not have empathy with your situation and with your point of view, given what you went through. And you mentioned people are trying to get you fired and they're harassing you, stalking you. Is it primarily over this issue, or are there other issues that you've talked about that have gotten the ire of would-be cancelers?
Yeah, so this is the primary issue. But I've also, made some critiques of what I would call liberal trans activism, or, identity reductionism, which I consider to be a form of thinking and activism which emphasizes certain identities while downplaying class and other identities. And they'd use that to sort of paint me as some monster. And the thing is that the group of people that are targeting me, they're trying to shut me and my organization down because of our stance on the sex trade, but they are opportunistically using anything else that we say on any other issue in order to interpret it in the worst possible manner, prosecute us for thought crimes and guilt by association, and then deplatform us and force us out of our jobs.
Well, and the irony, of course, is you work for a union which values class issues, obviously. So how they could prevail on the union to fire you for caring about class and not wanting to have everything reduced to identity, I don't know. We'll see. But the left in this country is, well, in my view, in a crisis because it has given up on the question of class and seems to be afraid of it, which is quite, again, strange to me as someone who is a Marxist and who, you know, understands class to be a critical, not the only, but critical division in society and a critical lever for social change. Please check out some of my books as well. This is one of my favorites, The Plot to Control the World. You learn about how your government of the United States has interfered in elections over 80 times throughout the world and has overthrown democratic governments only to install right-wing dictatorships. Hope you keep tuning in to Voice of the Voiceless. And of course, the other irony I see here, I mean, again, so you're being criticized for your position on sex work, even though you yourself was a sex worker. You're being criticized for being critical of identity politics, even though you have, you're the member of an oppressed identity. You're a trans woman. I assume you're a Latina, given your name. Am I correct about that?
Yes.
Now, you said have actually called you transphobic, even though you're a trans woman. I mean, what is the basis for people saying that?
Yeah. So, you know, they've called me a TERF. They've called me a transphobe. All sorts of words that just don't make sense. Part of their reasoning is that because most trans women are in the sex trade, that by me arguing against the sexual exploitation of people, that I'm trying to argue against trans women. But I try to tell them, like, that's a sign of our exploitation and marginalization in society. Your logic is backwards, but they don't accept that. My thoughts around the focus within trans activism on, you know, it's very individualistic. The idea, for example, of creating new gender identities and sexualities and to the point where everyone has their sort of unique individual identifier, I think, stems directly out of a culture of intense individualism. And then lastly, one of our members who is an elder and veteran in the struggle, who was involved in People's War against the fascist government, was locked up for 6 months in a military prison for her activism.
In Spain, I believe.
She once commented, in the Philippines?
In the Philippines. Okay, thank you. Okay, in the Philippines. Yeah. Okay.
She once commented that it's important for us to understand and have clear and precise definitions of the words we use. And she said that, you know, she doesn't understand this idea of a female penis. And I stand by her 100% because I don't understand that idea either. And apparently that also makes me hateful of other trans people.
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen the debates around that issue. And again, it seems to me you can, well, again, first of all, you're a trans woman. So the idea that you're transphobic is on its face absurd. But also just in general, these are complicated issues. People have different views on these things. It seems to me if you treat people with respect and dignity, whether you can go 100% with their views on these things, again, whether there can be a female penis, it seems to me that should not be the dividing line between who's a bad person and a good person. But that's what's happened. That is what has happened.
Exactly. And, in the end of the day, I might have a different understanding of biology and identity as you, but nothing I have ever advocated for has ever been an attempt to limit the rights of trans people. In fact, if you go to my college, I was the only trans student when I was there. And I organized a mass campaign of students and food service workers against our college police and our administration. And because of that, we ended up having policy for trans students written across the entire campus, every department. And now there's several trans students there. So the idea that someone who has materially benefited other trans people's lives through collective organizing is somehow transphobic because of guilt by association and committing a thought crime is the most absurd thing I have ever heard.
And I agree with you. It is absurd. Now, you said something. I just want to make sure I heard it right. And if I did hear it right, I'd like you to explain it. You said, if I heard you correctly, did you say that most trans women are in the sex trade? Is that the word did you say that? I mean, can you tell me what you said and what you meant by that? Because that was a stunning statement.
Yeah. So, that is the logic that gets applied to me by saying I'm transphobic for opposing the sex trade, because in their minds, most trans women are in the sex trade.
But is that true?
They're really...
Yeah. Is that true?
I think that the issue is pretty complicated, especially given the lack of, expansive research on this, or rather, wide and deep research. One, this issue is complicated by class, right? If you're somebody like Caitlyn Jenner, who's lived your life as a, wealthy white male, then you're likely not you're not gonna become, somebody in the sex trade or, in the sex industry after you transition. But if you come from a lower class background, and if you've been thrown out of your home for transitioning, or, experienced discrimination for wage jobs and don't have independent wealth, then there's a high likelihood that you're going to end up in the sex trade or in some form of the sex industry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is a shocking reality that I didn't realize, and it's important for people to realize that, obviously. What do you think? And I just want to ask you, again, I'm really asking out of curiosity. I have focused most of my writings and studies on U.S. imperialism. Okay, so these issues of gender are frankly things that I'm just learning. So what do you think, and I just want your honest opinion, what do you think of the concern of people like J.K. Rowling, who say that, look, basically some of the language that's now being used is making women disappear. We're now menstruators or birthing people or people with cervixes. And of course, people are trying to cancel her and others who say that. I mean, I'm just curious, what is your view on that?
Yeah, so let me sort of address this in two ways. One is addressing the idea, and then the other is what I believe to be the difference in reaction. Firstly, I think that there is a serious gap in a material analysis for trans people. So on one hand, you have an analysis that is extremely postmodern and disconnected from material reality. Gender is only in your head. You can have a beard and a short haircut and walk around in a male suit and make absolutely no effort to transition. And you should be allowed to go into the women's restroom because gender is not real and it's only in your head. On the other hand, you have what I would call some sort of like reactionary understandings to trans people, which are that, for example, trans women are a product of misogyny, or, the idea that like, sort of like we are, we just simply should be sort of like given therapy so that we are no longer trans, that it's like a disorder. I think that we should be able to find a sort of rational and materialist understanding. If you've transitioned, then you should be allowed to enter spaces that align with how you are presenting and how you are embodied. If you have not transitioned, then you likely should not be allowed in those spaces. At the same time, there's nothing wrong with using the word women. There's nothing wrong with understanding that for the majority of women, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth are very important, and central to their identity. And I think that there is this strong push to need to erase any differences between trans women and women who were born female. And I think that is just also absurd and disconnected from reality. If my kind of feminism isn't in solidarity with women like my mom, then it's not feminism. Now, in terms of J.K. Rowling, I think that there is a huge difference between canceling someone who is a billionaire and who likely is not going to be very affected by it versus canceling someone who doesn't have that class power and who can actually go homeless, lose their job, lose their money, etc., because of the targeted harassment campaign.
Yes, well, that is correct. And she has not been canceled because, as you say, it's virtually impossible to do that. Well, I think your view on those issues, I must say, aligns pretty closely with my view on those things. And again, it's a dangerous position to take in these times. But I firmly believe that people need to say what they think and what they feel and what they mean. I mean, obviously in a respectful way and not hurtful way, but people are allowed to ask questions. That's what bothers me. We can't even ask questions anymore about very important issues like the ones that you're raising.
Yeah. And, I think like what exemplifies this is that the phrases sex work is work and trans women are women, they're not simply slogans anymore, but they are a test of dogmatic adherence. So the two phrases are meant to shut down any conversation or any critical investigation of the issue. Does it matter that sex work is work? Does it matter that trans women are women? Do I have to conform to the category of women to have rights and respect in society? Or can I be a trans woman with a particular history and a particular identity and still be integrated, accepted, and respected and safe in society? And I think we need to start going beyond these slogans that we have outgrown.
Yeah, it's almost, and as I talk about in my book, there's almost a religiosity to it. These are almost religious incantations that you have to profess, whether you even really believe it or not. Again, it's like going to church and you say these things because you have to, right? And it prevents debate. It prevents rational discussion. And that's what we need. That's what we need to be able to move forward as a society, I think.
Absolutely. And, with the trans issue, I hesitate to comment on it because I don't like to speak when I haven't investigated something. And my views on trans identity are still in formation. I'm studying it, I'm looking at it historically. But I do think that there is this sort of witch hunt if you are transphobic. And I hate saying that because I know this will be used against me. Even my interview with you will be used against me. But people are investigating me and my history to see if they can uncover transphobia, which is just absurd to me.
It's so unfair. I mean, let me just say that you come across to me as first of all, intelligent, sincere, compassionate person. You are a heroic person, a brave person. And I can't see ever wanting to try to silence you or to, cancel you. I don't know what would possess someone to want to do that. You are someone that, if you led, I would follow. Let me just say that.
Yeah, thank you. And I really do appreciate that. And, I'm okay with people disagreeing with me, but I wish that they would just disagree with my argument and not attack me as a person and try to cut me off from any ability to support myself.
Well, that's right. And we call that in the legal field ad hominem attacks, right? When you can't argue the issue, you attack the man or you attack the woman, right? And we say in soccer, for example, you tackle the ball, not the player, right? But when you can't get to the ball, you attack the player. That's how it goes. And that's what's happening with you and so many other people that I know and that I care about. And it just, even from a political activism point of view, it doesn't make any sense because what you're doing is shutting people off who might be natural allies. Trying to tag someone as transphobic or racist or sexist when they're not, or they don't believe they are. Maybe they need some education, right? But if you start throwing these, insults around, people just are going to say, forget it. I'm not going to do the work anymore, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's almost like people are afraid to talk about it or afraid to ask questions because there's such backlash. So, people will sort of limit their understanding of an issue because they're so afraid that if they ask the wrong question or say the wrong thing, that they're going to have this huge amount of backlash and targeted harassment. And, I've been a union organizer. So I've knocked on workers' doors that do have conservative, reactionary, transphobic views. And the way I changed their mindset was not by canceling them, was not by harassing them. It was by fighting in solidarity with them on class issues, saying, let's talk about the issues you're going through at work. Let's fight your boss together. Let's get you those wages that were stolen from you. And by being in solidarity with them and not being entitled to them, not being entitled to their solidarity, but showing them I'm willing to be in solidarity with you first, eventually they came to understand things better than they ever would if I would have gotten up there and started accusing them.
Yes, well, I think that is the way to organize people, You attract bees with honey, not with vinegar, as they say. You're a very, again, impressive human being. And I'm really glad we had this conversation. I learned a lot. And you have friends. And, we talked before the show. I'm a lawyer. I'm a union veteran. And if you ever need backup, you can call on me.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I'm definitely excited to read your book.
Great, Esperanza. When it comes out, I'm going to send you a copy. I'll sign it for you. And let's stay in touch.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Esperanza. Have a great day. You've been watching Voice of the Voiceless. I'm Dan Kovalik, and you've been listening to a conversation I just had with Esperanza Fonseca. I hope you enjoyed it. Check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you do like this program, if you find it valuable to you, please consider joining us on Patreon. Thank you.